Greetings, everybody, while you join. I'm gonna give everybody a minute. And we're gonna let Jason rejoin. Boom, 10 a.m. my time, whatever your time is. Welcome to the webinar. A little bit of housekeeping to start with. Our second panelist, Devin, unfortunately, has a house full of kids with the flu. So we are going to excuse her from participating today. It looks like we still have a lot of people joining. I'm really excited. If you ended up getting a notice early this morning that the webinar started, I tried to do a practice session. Apparently it started actual. So I love technology. That's what we're getting ready to talk about today. So I'm going to both now be helping Jason move us along and doing everything in the background, which we're just going to roll with it today, okay? So welcome everyone to Edgewise Network's first webinar that we felt was really important for the industry. Just going through some practical guidance of what we can be doing right now for federal funding. So our industry is not new to changing administrations and priorities and resetting expectations. There are some differences this go around. So what we are looking to do today is just set you up with some initial background of where some of these changes have happened already and where we think they're going to go. So I'd like to introduce my longtime partner in crime, I will say partner in legal things and not crime. But Jason Pavluchuk and I have worked together for 20 years and have had a long-time partnership in exactly this. It is taking what's going on the Hill in DC and with federal funding and turning it into things that actually matter for our industry, for our communities, for all of us. So I would like to pass it over to Jason. Just say hi first.
Hello. Good
Okay, good.
afternoon.
Your microphone works. That's all I care about. Next slide, Jay.
Absolutely.
So as I said, unfortunately, Devin's not going to be here, but I am sure we will have Devin on a future webinar because she is smart and talented and we absolutely love her. But Jason's background, Jay, I'll let you say a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, hi, Jason Pavluchuk, founder of Pavluchuk and Associates. I've been in the transportation policy, funding, and advocacy space for roughly 25 years, working on both creating some of these funding programs as well as helping both public and private sector entities access some of this funding. So looking forward to chatting today. And again, Devin just texted me, very unhappy she cannot be here. She herself actually has the flu. She passed along her notes to me. I asked if I could do a Devin voice and sort of do a split character, and she told me absolutely not. So she sends her apologies, but the information that she will be providing will certainly be conveyed to you today.
There's a lot of absolutely not in the background of these changes this morning as we're texting back and forth. Absolutely not. I will also add, for those of you coming to this webinar hoping that I'm going to break out in song, I'm so sorry. It's just not that kind of a day. Maybe we can plan a future webinar where I add a little song and dance in the background, but no, Jason, no voice.
I can't sing either, Chrissy. I was promised at least 2 dancing and singing roles, so I
Yeah,
guess
never. I wouldn't do that to everyone attending. I would never do that to you. So let's go over the agenda for today. So we're going to talk through some of the latest administrative actions, what their impact has been so far, and there's a lot up in the air. So we're gonna talk through what we know. We may talk about like specifically identifying things we don't know, but we know the drill here. So giving you some better starting points for what to do in this next year. So what kind of funding might we expect? And then more specifically, how to be successful in your grant writing. There could be some changes, and they are looking at doing a new bill sooner than usual. So maybe before midterms. So there's some opportunity here to just kind of reset how we do things and then how that plays into the future of transportation funding. So Jason and I are going to do a little back and forth. I'm just going to note, we will mention some specific companies and specific projects. This webinar is not sponsored in any way, but there are a lot of companies that are doing things that fit into what this next administration has already talked about. So we're going to mention some of those. We're going to give some additional insight on who you might want to talk to, and even follow up after this webinar with some of that information. So it's being recorded. We will see if we can send you a copy of this afterwards. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jason for right now.
Chrissy, thank you very much, and I appreciate the work that you're doing in Edgewise. I think now more than ever, it's an incredibly critical time to be having a webinar like this and having these discussions. When we first sat down to talk about doing this webinar, it was just before the inauguration. As I mentioned, I've been doing this for roughly 25 years, and I've gone through a lot of presidential transitions. There's always change, right? Clinton to Bush to Obama, et cetera, et cetera. The regardless of what policy space you're in, there's inevitably some change. Even the first Trump administration, from Obama to Trump, there was change, but not quite like the change we've experienced in the last month. I will start by saying, as we got closer to the inauguration, one of the things that I had noticed and certainly had communicated to my clients and other both public and private forums is how the Trump administration was very much taking almost a Silicon Valley disruptor personality, whereby the company itself, the government or the Trump administration was just going to take a sledgehammer and an axe and just sort of create chaos. They've done that. They've certainly done that, especially in the transportation space. But within that, there are some constants. What I think I've noticed in the past few weeks is that amongst the significant amount of chaos, the significant amount of change and new, there is certainly a level of constant, but there is this cloud of dust. And I think the cloud of dust is what is right now most dangerous. And I think that is in many ways, in some ways by intent. But I remind my clients, I remind those I talk to sort of take a deep breath and take a step back and look at the forest from the trees. So I'm going to go through a couple of things that the administration has done, some changes, and sort of dive into what's real, what's a threat, and where we go from here. Because I think, again, before we planned this webinar, this slide, this section was not a thing. But I don't think we can honestly talk about grants and funding for FY25, at least touching on some of the things that have come up, clear the air, and then move into what we hope will be significant opportunity for either your agency or your company, but more importantly, transportation in general. So we'll start with the quote unquote funding pause. As the administration came in, literally within the first 12 hours, they put a pause on any and all IIJA and IRA, which is legislation known as the Inflation Reduction Act. It's also commonly referred to as the Green New Deal, but I will note that as a nickname. Put a freeze on all that on all those funding. Within 12 hours, there was a court injunction to stop it, as well as other court actions and a somewhat reversal from uh, from the administration saying that they wanted to provide oversight to the funding that is going out with which is within their jurisdiction. A week later, there was a broader government-wide funding freeze that was widely talked about in the press, which also would have incorporated transportation dollars. Again, numerous courts in both what I'll call red, purple, and blue districts came out and said that is not allowed. You cannot pause funding without justification and without reason, without cause. There are still reports government-wide that some funding has been frozen. But as far as transportation is concerned, everything appears to be moving forward. I won't say as normal, but it's moving forward. If the state DOT submitted funding for reimbursement today for a bridge project, it would get reimbursed. If a transit agency was scheduled to get a grant on Monday to buy a bus, it is likely going to get that check on Monday, maybe Tuesday. What is being applied and what we do know is this extra layer of oversight that will be at the very top level of DOT. And I'll talk about that in a minute. So while there is this discussion of a funding pause, generally speaking, most transportation funding will continue to flow. At worst, we will see a little bit of a slowdown in terms of how long it takes for DOT to process a grant, reimbursement, what have you. And I know some of you are laughing, a slowdown to a process that already can take 18 months. Really what they're doing is they're adding 106th and 107th step in terms of what it's doing. They have no legal authority to stop. The only thing that I've
Wait,
seen.
hang on. I want to go back
Yep,
to the legal authority to
sure.
stop. So this is where the webinar gets spicy. So I want to go back to just that pinpoint on the rule of law and what that actually looks like for us, because I'm guessing that that's why a lot of people joined. And so I want to make sure that we're focusing on the points that I think people are wanting to hear. And participants, feel free to send me things in the chat. I'm watching. And so if there's specific questions that you want us to answer, if I think that we have the capability to answer right now, we will. So Jay, rule of law.
Yeah, I mean there's something called, I believe it's the 1974 Impoundment Act. The executive branch cannot, when Congress decides to spend money on something, they authorize and they appropriate it. Long-standing law going back decades says that the government can't decide not to spend it. It doesn't say how long they have to, they have to spend it. They can't receive money for a grant purpose and then not allocate it. Now, there are certainly ways that they can stall it and slow it down and not make it a priority. To be very fair, we saw that with the Biden administration, where certain things which were their priorities were the first notices of funding availability out the door. But things that were secondary or tertiary to what their goals were some of the last grants to be made available. So that is not uncommon in an administration. What would be uncommon is we are not going to, for example, make available bus facility money. We're not going to make available the SMART grant. And again, there's no indication that they were ever going to do that. I think most of the focus that we have understood, both behind the scenes and in public, are that they're really focusing on some of the billions of dollars from electric vehicle charging stations. So, to give you an example of how this administration is approaching it, there's something called the Electric Vehicle National Network, NEVI, the NEVI program. The legislative language requires DOT to create guidance and then The states that receive the money and go after the money have to follow the guidance. Well, about a week into the process, DOT scrapped the Biden guidance and said, we are not making funding available until we write our own guidance. If you're looking to get NEVI money, I would not hold your breath, because I don't think they're going to expedite developing new NEVI guidance. Now, eventually they will have to do it, but it's not like it's going to be imminent. It's not like it's going to come out next month. Whereas with bus facility, there is no guidance. There is no tie between a legislative or a regulatory action that DOT or FTA have to make and making bus facility money available. So a lot of those programs, they really are, their hands are tied. They're going to fund them. And from what I understand, talking to both people within the Office of the Secretary and the new Federal Transit Administrator's office, or the nominated Federal Transit Administrator, those funds will flow per usual. Again, I think what we're seeing here is not a pause as much as an added layer of oversight that will be added. And I should also mention that there's a number of federal employees that have left DOT or have been told to leave. This administration came in, and anyone who was under what is effectively known as under administrative review, you join the federal government, you are not a full federal employee with all the rights associated until, I believe, in some cases it's 1 year and 2 years. So if you've been with FTA, or you've been with FTA for 2 years, or DOT for 2 years, the administration came in and just said, everyone, you're no longer, you're laid off. So there were a lot of people in the grant review department that have come aboard in the last year or two, and all of those employees were laid off, a vast majority of them. So certainly, we have a double-edged sword where there's an added layer of scrutiny to the grant process, and then there's also fewer people to review grants, fewer people to process them. So, I think the two major outcomes of the administrative steps so far is the cloud of dust and confusion, which can be crippling. And I urge you all to sort of move forward. When we talk to DOT, their answers back to us, and whether they're telling us the truth or not, is things are as normal, move forward. I would urge all of you to do the same, because until they take effectively what would be an illegal action, the only people stopping progress are ourselves for a lot of different ways, in a lot of different ways. So certainly, I think keep tabs on it, but also proceed as you normally would, both from a vendor and a public agency side. That would be my top advice.
So
But
I
again,
like this strategy. So part of what I like about it is, if you are an agency and you had programs that you've been like spinning up. So you've done some background on vendors, you've done some background on solutions, like what that looks like. Keep them going and have them ready, because it sounds like one of the things of this kind of administrative changes is there's going to be a delay. So fewer federal employees mean that you're going to have less people to even get these programs going. But also, if there was a court battle at some point, again, that's part of the delay. So until we know for sure things aren't happening, don't us delay on our own. Keep them in the background. Keep going with your grant applications. Jason, let's move forward, because we are
yep.
not going to make it.
What I will say is the other thing I would mention is, before we get into the grants, is that there's certainly a new set of priorities within this administration, and the last administration focused on what is known as Justice 40, the concept that 40% of the benefits of infrastructure should be felt by low income and communities, disadvantaged communities. This administration has scrapped that. Instead, they're putting a lot of their focus on safety, and a lot of their focus on areas that have high birth rates and high marriage rates. It is not a normal metric that transportation planners look at, yet it is a metric, and it is a metric just the same as Justice 40 would have been. I am not backing politically either, but what I am saying is that is certainly the rules that they're establishing. They're looking at user pay models. They're looking at metrics that help families. Um, and so I think as you move forward, those are things that certainly you should be keeping in mind when you're writing grants. Um, you know, Chris, I don't know if you want to cover any more on in terms of the Trump actions, but if not, we can probably go straight into the opportunities that are going to be here. I think in the next 6 to 12 months.
So what Jason was just talking about is a memo that came from Secretary Duffy. And so if you've heard of that memo, that's where that was coming from. I think
And what I'll say about this administration is for better or worse, they put everything right on paper. What they want to do, what they're trying to do, is not a secret. Whether you like it or not, it's there for everyone to see. Sometimes a little bit too blatantly, but it's not as though it's a riddle that we have to solve. They are very clear in terms of what they're looking to achieve and how they're looking to achieve it. And in transportation, certainly I look at it and I see a lot of different ways that transportation politics or processes and projects can play into those. So with that, I'll sort of dive into the funding opportunities. Um, this is an old chart that we've used for many years. And at this point, it's almost old. This is a look at the FAST Act, which is the federal legislation that funds transportation, and then the current one, IIJA. We are now in year 4 of IIJA, year 4 of 5. So we are coming to the close of what is and what was a generational investment in infrastructure. I have used this line, and I can't wait till this bill is done, so I don't have to use it ever again. It was generational. We'll find out very soon whether it was once in a generation. That said, one of the landmarks of IIJA was the significant increase in the number of competitive grant programs. Prior to IIJA, there were probably 3, maybe 4 competitive grant programs, a year. But now with the new bill, there were upwards of 50 last year. One thing I will note, and something that we're going to get into right now, is that last year, the Biden administration really spent a lot of time trying to get money out the door. So we have here 2025 grants that will likely be available this year. They will be available this year. To the right, you will see a number of grants in red. A vast majority of those grant programs are in red, largely because the money that was made available for FY25 and FY26 that were already going through a competition. A handful of these grants, EV charging and reconnecting communities, will be certainly reviewed, and I anticipate that they will not be made available. But infra, rural, mega, the bridge grants, those dollars have already been spent. And again, it was the Biden administration's priority to get those dollars out the door as quickly as possible. Even though the money itself was for FY25, FY26, they had the ability, and they went ahead and had a competition for those dollars. But don't worry, there's plenty of money left over, especially for innovation, for safety, for transit. On the highway side, I want to focus on a few programs. Build Raise, that is the program that dates back to 2008. It's been called Tiger, it's been called Build, it's been called Raise. It is now back to being called Build. That money is for FY25 is $1.5 billion. There's a little bit of confusion about this program, I should note. The Biden administration opened the competition up right around Christmas, with a due date of January 27th, I believe it was. 2 days before, which was again after the inauguration, 2 days before the program and the notice was set to close, Secretary Duffy came out with his set of proposals. They had an amendment to the raise grant, but at that point closed the grant portal 2 days before the grants were due. And the portal never really opened back up. So there's a lot of question as to what is the status of FY25 raise grants? Will it be reopened? Will it be recompete? I've been told that is still being determined, that they had a number of submissions put in, but that they will likely do a combined FY25 and FY26 raise grant at some point later this year. So we will certainly have raise money, build money, excuse me. Got to get in the habit of calling it build again later this year. And build and raise are typically large capital projects. Most of the grants are anywhere between 5 million and as high as 25 million. But we'll talk about how you and your company and your agency can better utilize that program and add smaller elements, which I know many of you are interested in. There are
Jason, I'm going to also add in, because I'm getting a hilarious number of both questions in the chat and people texting me. I love this. I love you people. I love that you're like, I am getting my question in through whatever means I have to contact you necessary.
Do it. Ask away.
Yeah, so there's a couple as we go through, and we are almost a half an hour, so we're going to have to hustle through some of these things. But the questions are, first of all, recognizing it's a completely different world right now. There are some things that are supposed to come out. So Protect Grant is supposed to come out in fall of 2026. Is that still looking like it's going to take place? We have people ask, do we think that award criteria might be more favorable to ROI, impacting transit operations, less interest in community impact environmental? And we even had some questions about the commute to work benefit because it's section 132F in the tax code. So let's fit in where some of these answers are going to be as we keep going through, because I think we have a lot of suggestions in the coming slides.
Yep. I will, yes. And I'll get to those right now, actually. I will start with the Protect grants. I do believe Protect grants will be made available. I believe there's going to be a significant amount of administrative input that is going to be made. So do I think they'll be made available? Yes. Do I think it'll be this spring? No. I think there will be Protect grants made available later in Q4, possibly as late as Q1 of next year. That's why I kind of have it in the red off to the side. I think Protect grants are things that this administration is and will be interested in. I think they have to grasp it and have to recognize it as a resiliency rather than climate change. And those are two very different things. And I'll actually talk about that in a minute. What I'll say is, actually, I'm not going to go through all these programs in light of time, but these are the programs that will be made available. We've got 100 million left of SMART, actually about 200 million left of SMART. For FY25, it'll be 100 million. Congestion relief is 50. Attain, those are all technology based. Safe Streets for All still has $1 billion for both FY25, FY26. I think with Safe Streets for All, there will be a much greater focus on technology than street design. So if you are doing intersection improvements, if you're doing transit vehicle priority, emergency vehicle priority, those types of projects, that is where I think we will see more safe streets. I think these are also rail programs with bus facility. I'll answer your question right here. Yes, ROI, efficiency, effectiveness will be what this administration is looking after. So they will be more focused on how to provide more advanced service rather than just simply more service. Said a different way, they're going to want to see a bus and see transit services be connected, have the latest fare collection, have safety features that do not rely upon a police force of 5,000. They're going to want to use as much AI as possible in transit. So all of the things that bring transportation or bring transit to the to the next level from a technology standpoint is what this administration will be looking at, not necessarily more service, community design. So certainly if you're a transit agency, Figure out a way to include what I will talk about later, which is sort of the ornaments on the tree. Don't just buy 50 buses. Figure out a way to talk about how, including in the 50 buses you want to buy, you're going to revamp your wayfinding. You're going to revamp your technology on board all of your buses. Those are things that this administration is going to go after. I do want to shout out, you mentioned some companies that do some good things. As Chrissy knows, I work with GenFair. They actually have developed a really good grant guide. I would urge all of you, if you have questions about individual programs, instead of me rifling off the do's and don'ts and highs and lows of every program, go to this website. This link will be made available. It's a phenomenal tool to sort of describes every available program, how much is available, the match, all the things that you're going to want to be looking for. The other thing I will mention before we get into tips is that congressional earmarks remain a thing. If you recall, earmarks were very popular in the 2000s, early 2000s. Then we had a lobbyist by the name of Jack Abramoff decide to do some naughty things. See, there was one voice I could work in there, Chrissy. Do some naughty things, and earmarks went away in 2008. They were brought back after COVID, and it appears they will remain. What I have to the left is actually straight from the House Appropriations website. This was the guidance for last year that looks at what the rules are. You can see there, capital projects has to go to a public agency, has to be in the STIP or the TIP, et cetera, et cetera. I expect similar guidance this year. I also expect a similar timeline because we still haven't finished the FY25 appropriations bill. So the FY26 process will be delayed. So if you have a project that is somewhere between $500,000 and $3 million, I'd start to talk to your congressman about it today, because this portal, these requests will likely be made available end of March, early April, and you want to begin to talk to offices about that now. So, writing a successful grant. Anytime, and I get brought in to write a lot of grants, I think the most important thing is know your audience. Know your audience. This administration, as I mentioned, is very focused on efficiency, effectiveness, recognizing the current Secretary of Transportation has 9 children. Family is very important to him personally. So that's certainly weaving itself into his own experience, is weaving itself into guidance. And you see that in the form of one of the metrics that they will be using to identify winning projects are those that support areas of high marriage and high birth rates, which you can find on census. It's as easily as to find as income demographics. You can see birth rates and marriage rates as well. And then when I talk about how a project will help a family. Again, if you're doing an intersection redesign, certainly speaking to the safety of an intersection. My daughter is 17. She just got her car a few months ago, and I actually somehow last night was the first time that she drove me, just us. Her and I went to dinner, and as we approached a red light, and I'm so used to my wife braking at the last second, I thought to myself, who did she learn how to brake from, me or my wife? The good news is it was me. She takes her mother on everything else, thank God. But as far as braking and driving, but I thought about that moving the intersection, and certainly speaking to those types of analogies and that type of how does a project impact families? Those are things that I would write to. Focus on cost effectiveness, focus on safety, avoid discussion of climate change benefits. That doesn't mean to say that a project doesn't have climate change benefits. Using fare collection as an example, the faster we get people on and off buses, the less a bus idles, which has dramatic climate change savings, right? But I don't want to talk about the climate change, the climate's benefits. I want to talk about the efficiency, the effectiveness. Now that bus isn't sitting there waiting for people to find loose change. They're able to move as quickly as possible. and thus make the whole system more efficient and effective. So it's
So I
not to
want to
say
talk
that,
about some of
go
the
ahead.
sufficient, effective stuff.
Yep,
And you do nothing but talk in a straight line, so I'm just going to keep interrupting you. That's
please
how we
do.
roll. So there's a couple more questions that we'll get to in a second, and we're going to try to answer them all. But I want to talk more specifically about the kinds of programs. So first of all, OMPO had guidance that came out that talked about pausing to the step tip process. We can try to like crystal ball why we think that is, but part of it could simply be they're trying to understand what projects you've already talked about. So I think an additional point here is identify projects you haven't talked about yet. And that seems counter to how we typically work. It needs to be in the STIP or the TIP to be something that's funded, but think innovatively about how you might do things. I also believe in addition to efficiency, some of that is how do you as agencies simply become resilient from a funding perspective? So if we look at bus lane enforcement, like what Hayden AI is doing, I think that there's some opportunities for enhancing your ability to make money in your region. And that may be some strategy here. So maybe that's some of the strategy. We want more state and local ability to raise funds. That may also cause some new legal barriers. So there can be some additional like what ifs down the line. Feel free to get back in touch with Jason and I when that's the case. There are capabilities of charging for curbside management and parking in new and different ways, which will bring us to that commuter benefit question in a second. But I am in San Diego. I live in San Diego, full disclosure, but I'm here this week at the Secure Tech Alliance conference and introducing a company by the name of Appiway that is doing just that in London. And they can manage some of those public assets in a much more effective way. So how do we raise money in programs that are different than the programs that we've talked about in the past? And then how can we enhance our efficiency overall in some of these new technologies that have been in existence? They're not completely new, but it may not have been identified in the things that you're doing. So Jason, you can add to that.
Yeah, actually it's a great point. I mean, leveraging, again, one of the priorities um for the administration is concept of user pays, and that really sort of, I think, spans across the number. So looking at ways to create revenue within the system itself. So whether it's signage and marketing, it's those are things that when you bring that to the table, um, it's incredibly important, I think, for agencies to look at, and I think also for the vendors on the phone here, figure out how what it is that you're selling and how what it is that you're trying to provide to agencies, whether it's transit or highways, how there might be the opportunity to create, and maybe there's not, but create revenue, or create partnerships in a way that it benefits. I think one of the things that we're going to see, and I think it's going to surprise a lot of people, is that I think there's going to see a greater, we're going to see a greater uh, connection between developers and transit. I actually think that there's an opportunity to do a lot of transit-oriented development in this new administration, because TOD is a phenomenal development opportunity for if and when done the right way. The key will be how do you integrate low and medium income housing, and that's, I think, what will be missing from this administration's push. But I think you're going to see certainly opportunity for TOD. But again, thinking about that, taking a step back and looking at, as Chrissy mentioned, enforcement cameras that can generate revenue, but also keep people safer. Looking at a lot of these different tactics and opportunities, and thinking that through, I think the more agencies can get creative at looking at how technology, how something simple as signage can be used as a revenue source, things of that nature. But again, I think final point I want to make about how to write a successful grant proposal this administration is, As I mentioned, the things that you're working on do not have to have, or you don't have to hide, or they can be climate positive. But again, that's not your front foot. Your front foot is these other things. And again, I look at transit-oriented development, and from a transit nerd, I think about, isn't it cool that we can have a 15-minute city? Well, what you're also creating is economic development for small business. You're creating creating housing. You're creating opportunity through that TOD that has nothing to do with the transit itself. Focus and find those things, and they're there. They're there, and if you need help finding them, call Chrissy and we'll walk you through it. The final thing I want to mention is I sort of talked about this a little bit before is I use this concept in a lot of my conversations with my clients. Basically I call it, hanging an ornament on the tree. There's only so many ways you can look at certain transportation projects and make them sexy. A bus is a bus, right? You want to buy a bus, you're going to buy a bus. But the difference between I'm buying a bus versus I want to buy a bus and equip it with security features, the latest in wayfinding, the latest in fare collection, the latest in safety features. It's very different. So find ways to hang ornaments on the tree and find those ornaments that can do the things we talked about, can focus on safety, can focus on effectiveness and efficiency, that focus on transit in the 21st century. A project that has those elements will absolutely score better in this administration than just simply, I want to buy an electric bus. So think about that as you put your grant together, that a $8 million package with the quote unquote bells and whistles will look better than a $5 million bus purchase. And that goes to highways as well. Find ways to integrate ITS, technology, innovation, public-private partnerships as well. And those don't have to be pricing necessarily. There's a lot of different ways we can create those.
So
Finally,
we are being asked a couple of questions, and I'm going to put it right here because it matters. So how important is it to adjust the wording to reflect improving efficiency and cost effectiveness in tech without appearing woke? And so I just want to add, I think there's a little bit of practical common sense, and let's say instead of practical, let's say common sense of how we know you're going to polarize your grant application or any of your projects. If you know that something is contrary, but it's still something that is a major goal in your agency, there are a lot of, the federal government is clearly embracing public-private partnerships, and there are plenty of private partners that have been partners for decades in this work. So Genfair is a great example. So they have always had a cash policy. They want to keep cash, but have invested in all of the tech to bring it to enabling choice. So simply focusing on that enabling choice, making sure that you're ingesting all of the new tech while still having cash, which is going to meet equity, without saying those words. And I just personally struggle as a human of things I know are part of my career and part of the things that are important in our industry, and saying those things while also making sure that once I say words that I will be heard by the people who I'm talking to. So I think that is an important framing here. If your agency was talking about going fare free last year, I think you have to know where that would go, and that there's a lot more at stake right now of giving talking points that aren't going to be helpful to anyone's projects. So I want to go back to that commuter benefits conversation. I think that as a industry, we can be looking at how are we increasing what we do with commuter benefits? So you can Vanpool, maybe we look at in the next administration, getting some funding for carpool, because now we have technology that can prove out the same stuff that we do for Vanpools, and the fact that those are still part of your network of services. Maybe because parking is involved in that, maybe now you can connect your fare collection system with your payment system for the parking services? And how can you really enable more economic development in regions because you're connecting those technologies? I think that these are the areas where we need to be both creative and cutting edge and push ourselves to think past what traditional projects have been. This is a good opportunity to do that. So the Chrissy Ditmore trying to focus on where we can be positive and elicit still the good change that we want to see. I think that these are words and approaches that we can implement to make that happen.
Yeah, I would just reiterate, I mean, this administration is using, in many ways, AI. They're avoid keywords. To answer the question that you asked, avoid using keywords. The word diversity should not include anywhere in your application. Climate change, carbon reduction should not. I think the best way I would describe it is environmental benefits. Even that I sort of would be cautioned. And again, I think I've had this conversation with people and they get a little mad, and I use the analogy, do you want to be an advocate or an activist? If you want to be an activist, then you can get up and talk about it and fight the fight, but activists rarely win. Advocates do. So certainly if you want to advocate for, and again, not to criticize in any way, shape, or form, I'm very clear about that. But if you want to win a grant, you have to play the game that they're playing, and that involves avoiding keywords. Again, a little bit of common sense. Diversity, carbon reduction, climate change, inclusion, equity. Those are words that just would not. I would do have done it a sweep of those words to make sure they're not anywhere in my application itself.
So I have a comment that says, how sad is this? And I think the point here is stuff is going to happen outside of our control. What are the things we can control? And how do we continue to impart joy in both our personal and professional lives and in our communities? Which means, how can we improve some things in the lives of people? So I'm trying hard to not pull it down to that, but let's solution some things together so that we can move things forward. And I think that that's part of the approach that we're taking here today. Some very specific guidelines. So actually, Jason, let's do that.
Guidelines for.
Sorry, I just mean continue moving on because I just looked at the time and we are rolling fast.
Yeah. And again, and just to comment on that, because I think it's a general, I think a little bit, some of these webinars the last month, it's been a little bit of group therapy. I try to take my hat off. I've been a professional for 25 years, and I try to, regardless of the administration, remain professional and neutral. What I will say is this is a different administration, as I mentioned at the onset, very much a disruptor, coming like a wrecking ball. That is not a Miley Cyrus reference, simply what it is, a wrecking ball. It's been challenging. I will tell you, at least for me personally, because there's so much change. But again, if you look at it, if you take the visceral, if you take, I think, some of what is happening away, and you just, to Chrissy's point, look at how do we move forward, and the things that we're going to do, the things you're going to do, are going to change lives, hopefully for the better. And if we've got to use certain words to do it, listen, truth be told, in the Biden administration, similar things had to happen. If you weren't speaking about climate change, if you weren't speaking about how your project impacted low income, and again, taking politics out of it, and it is a little different. Certainly that's what we did. The whole transportation world learned DEI. The whole transportation world spoke more about climate change, before it ever had. So I think sort of taking it in that context, and again, focusing on trying to get the job done. That said, the next chapter of transportation will be written in the next 2 years. As Chrissy mentioned, there's a good chance, not a great chance, but a good chance that the reauthorization of IIJ will occur in the next year and a half. In fact, the committees, many of whom are listed here on the screen, are in the process right now of holding hearings and bringing ideas in. I think there are five basic questions that we have to look at. And it is, I think, truly a critical time for transportation because IIJA brought in so much money, and we're at a sort of now what moment. The reality of it is that the amount of money gas taxes bring in doesn't come close to paying for IIJA. So that really, in this political context, is very important. Um, One thing I'll mention too is IIJA was more than just surface transportation. There were ports, airports, a lot of rail, a lot of non-transportation infrastructure included. I think when the elections came through, it was very clear the next bill will very much be more of a surface transportation bill. There may be a few things added, but for the most part, we can really expect for the next bill simply to be very much like it has been for the last 25 years, where it's highways, transit, and we're hoping some element of rail included in that. The most important question that'll be asked is what is the baseline? Without getting too wonky, the transportation bill and IIJA was part one, but the second part of this was something called advanced appropriations. And advanced appropriations were about $120 million, or $120 billion of funding added on top of the core formula, the core programs. And a lot of that money came in the form of discretionary grants. Not all of it, but most of it was competitive grants. So when we look at transportation, it's always a look back. How did the FAST Act compare to MAP 21? How did MAP 21 compare to the FAST, Safe TLU? How did Safe TLU compare to, I can go back as far as ICE T, and then I'm done. But, how do they compare to the years prior, right? What are we comparing it to? We can't compare it to IIJA. So will it be just the Title One portion of IIJA, or are we adding the advanced appropriations? That's all about $120 billion difference of are we doing the same, better, or worse? So once there's an agreement on what that baseline is or a general understanding, then we'll have a better idea of how much money we're looking at. I think right now we're tending towards a smaller baseline, but just to be very blunt, this is a president and administration that in 2019 was suggesting a $2 trillion transportation bill. So do not be surprised if one day this summer the president wakes up and decides he wants a massive, big, beautiful, exorbitant transportation bill. It is very, very, very possible. And again, once he says that, Republicans will have to follow, and Democrats will too. I think what we're looking at too is, as I mentioned, there's so many competitive grant programs. That was so new. So will we see those competitive grant programs continue? Early returns are not as many of them. I think we all agree, even those of us who advocated for many of these programs, it was too much. Too much for vendors to focus, too much for individual agencies to focus, too much for DOT to manage. And now that like 30% of the people that were in charge of reading grants are gone, I cannot imagine how DOT would at this state manage all of those grant applications. So at the very least, I think we're going to see a lot of those programs either fold in together or become formula programs or fold into formula programs. The what, where, why, and how will still be determined. I still think there will be a large competitive grant program like Build because it's been very successful. I still think there will be some individual grant programs like Bus Facility, like Smart, but it's a matter of which ones, how much will they be, etc. That will sort of play out. And by the way, if you have an opinion, now's the time to share it with your members of Congress. I think you're going to see a growing influence in the role of local and regional governments. I think one of the reasons why there are so many new grant programs was because so few local and regional governments have direct access to transportation dollars. That's loud and clear. So far, Democrats have made it very clear that prioritizing formula funding for local and regional governments is their priority. So I think you're going to see MPOs and local governments actually have real money, not in the sense of You get to create these plans and maybe we'll fund them, but actually create your plans and we're going to provide funding for them. And then the biggest question is, can we stay friends? Not us, we'll always be friends, Chrissy, but will the left and the right, will the left and the right stay friends? Right now, all parties are saying the right thing, saying that transportation has been bipartisan forever and ever, and there's nothing that's going to change that. We'll find out. Both chairman and ranking member of the House and Senate committees have publicly stated that, but it does not take a genius to realize that we are in very tumultuous political times. And while they may want to work together, will the politics of the day allow them? Will their party leadership allow them? That goes for both sides, R and D. We don't know. The great news is that right now they're all saying the right thing. And I can tell you, knowing many of them personally, they truly do believe it. They really want this to be a bill that brings Congress together, and they can move forward and say, here's an example of what can happen when we work together. So that is where they're at now, and hopefully it's where they'll be. Chrissy, with
So
that, if there are any other
yeah, so we
questions,
have 5 minutes left. I'm going to try to get back through a couple of these questions. One was, any thought on low-no ZEB funding? Do we think ZEB associated equipment is going to be toxic in bus facilities? So I think in general, low-no as a program may not be released. Initially, it's probably not going to be one of the first ones, but again, it's part of the law. So eventually, again, keep your projects going, keep your grant applications at the ready. There could be part of this in general. The delay, once it happens, is there could be a strategy of like having a 2-day window. So have all of your projects ready regardless. And for anything new that you're writing, understand what the words we just said, understand all of the things that we said. I think that toxic, I don't know if it's going to help you. So I'm not sure about that. But I think that focusing in on the areas where you need to do something different. So if you have already purchased a lot of electric buses and you need a infrastructure for charging, this may be an opportunity now, different than before, to partner with the private sector to help fund that for you. Jason worked on exactly that kind of project with Anaheim Transit Network. So there are different ways that we can approach some of these problem sets, and I think are going to impart some just new ways of doing business. And that's also okay. It's okay for us to do that. We had a question about what about Thriving Communities funding? I personally have heard nothing about where that's going, but I can't imagine again that it would be something that was at the ready for them to release. Jason, do you have any insight on that?
yeah, I think they're wrapping up a lot of the Thriving Communities projects. I do not expect any round. I think that is, I'm not even sure how much money was available. My guess is if they do it, they will completely change the criteria. I think it'll have a real focus. They're not canceling any of the grants, which is good. Because legally they probably could have. They haven't yet. But if they do another round of Thriving Communities, I think again it'll have a very different look to it. It'll be about, my guess is, rural communities and how those communities can get access to healthcare, education, etc. Again, things that I think we can all participate in, or many of us can. But I do not expect Thriving Communities to to look the same. And as far as bus facility and the Low-No program, Low-No is an interesting one because it's authorized and there's very narrow uses of the money. I'll be very curious to see how they handle that, whether they just release it all once. Listen, the first round administration, his first term, they made the money available. Low-No's been around for 15 years. It's just always been smaller dollar amounts. Will they look to repurpose some of it? Will they look to expand the definition of what a low emission vehicle is and focus on some of the gas cell? They might. I don't know. But they're going to have to make it available. And the new FTA administrator is a congressman by the name of Mark Molinaro, who's from upstate New York. and is a transit guy. It was very, very, it was very, what's the word I'm looking for? Optimistic when he was nominated. He was widely supported by transit advocates, widely supported by his local ATU and the ATU National in general, which gives me hope that he will come in and sort of, I would say, steady the ship, but sort of steady the ship a little bit, and we'll make the money available, et cetera, et cetera. But
All right,
also,
Jason, we just turned over to 11 a.m.
okay.
my time. So I'm going to cut you off so that we can give everybody their time back. I will say thank you so much to the more than 100 people that registered and attended today. I will definitely have all of the follow-up. I put in the chat both the link to that guide that is on GenFair's website. I will add, it's not behind a registration page, so you can just download it. So that was very kind of them to do. And the contact us page from the Edgewise Network site, if you have follow-up questions or did not hear something today that you want to see in a future webinar. Thank you, Jason, for coming and for stepping in and for letting us hear more about what's going on. And I do think that as this continues to build out, we will have more conversations and try to be open and try to be optimistic, and to make sure that we have fun in this life. So thank you all so much for joining.
Okay, Chrissy, thank you.
Yeah.